Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and in just a handful of days, War Within expansion will be launching for some of you, which will be the very first time players will be able to level a brand new character and experience some of the endgame activities that will be available for the first few weeks, dungeons and delves specifically included. So for today's video, I want to do an overall dungeon guide for the first season of the War Within expansion. But because of the changes that we saw with normal, heroic, Mythic 0 and Mythic Plus dungeons, even all of the original War Within Mythic 0 dungeons will offer competitive starting gear at the start of a brand new season. And I want to make sure that you're walking into this brand new expansion aware and ready for the challenges ahead, whether it is certain specific boss mechanics and how to deal with them effectively, or unique dungeon mechanics that are being brought in from older expansions. As you can see by the length of this video, it is a very extremely long project, not something I do on a regular, but I will have chapter marks for all of these dungeons, so if you want to skip around to the instances you aren't familiar with, then feel free to do so, especially if you want to come back to this video later on. If you want to see more guides for the War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. Otherwise, enjoy Dungeons for the War Within Season 1. So starting off with these dungeons, we have first the non-seasonal dungeons that you'll be able to access, as well as get some mythic gear from, starting with things like the Rookery. The Rookery is a 3-man dungeon with just a handful of bosses, first one being Kairos. During the Kairos encounter, there's going to be quite a few group-wide damage components, such as lightning dashes, which you'll want to avoid, as well as watch out for chain lightning, which will hit the entire group, as well as lightning raining down from the sky. The main mechanics you'll want to watch out for the boss are going to be the lightning torrent. When the boss reaches 100 energy, the boss will jump towards the center of the arena. During this time, the boss will bear a massive beam of lightning that will then travel across the circular boss room. You'll want to avoid this beam to make sure you don't take a ton of damage or get stunned by the beam. So as a melee class, you have a very limited window to get all your damage out onto the boss, so make sure you're not holding any of your cooldowns until you see the energy going up closer to 100%. Besides this, the mythic difficulty of the boss is going to mark one player with an unstable charge. During this time, right before the charge goes off, you want to actually jump into the center of the boss arena where the boss is going to be in order to have that charge discharge there. This will cause it to be popped back up in the arena while not AoEing the rest of your group members. The next boss is Stormguard Corin, who has a handful of abilities. The first one being Chaotic Corruption, which the group will want to manage, and the healer is going to have to be very involved with this ability. Chaotic Corruption is a damage over time effect that has multiple charges, but when it is removed, one of the charges gets removed and then the dot gets passed to another player. Dispelling this dot does a decent bit of AoE damage, and the dot itself will mean that the healer will want to focus that player specifically. Also, when the dot is dispelled, it leaves that player who just got dispelled vulnerable, so you want to make sure not to pass the dot to that same player twice in a row. The boss is going to use an ability of Dark Gravity, which will kind of channel all of the voidy energies around him, pulling all the players to him, and then dealing AoE damage, knocking players back afterwards, so there'll be a lot of displacement going on through the encounter. The boss will also do a leap called Crush Reality, where you charge the hammer, leap into a player's location, leaving a void puddle on the ground, but also causing these void tears to shoot out from its location. So it's a lot of movement and a lot of avoidance while trying to manage the dot dispel mechanic. The final boss of this dungeon is Voidstone Monstrosity, who has a handful of mechanics. First of all, from this encounter, you'll be assisted by Stormrider Vokmar to assist you for some of the special tasks throughout this encounter. First things first, it's a big immobile boss, so the tank is going to want to stay near the boss at all times, otherwise the boss radiates entropy, doing a ton of group-wide damage. The tank will also want to face away the boss from the party in order to avoid everybody getting hit by Oblivion Wave, which is a specific tank frontal. Null Upheaval is a big AoE ability the boss is going to do, which will cause everybody to want to dodge out of the voidy puddles. This Null Upheaval also creates seeping fragments that will slowly eventually start to cover the ground with growing void. During that time, players, however, will be marked by Stormstrider Vorkar with a Storm Rider's charge, allowing them to get close to these fragments in order to detonate and destroy them, clearing out some of the space in the boss arena. The boss is going to be surrounded by a void shell, which is essentially you're not attacking the boss, but rather you're attacking the boss's shield. And certain classes actually have talents and abilities that can deal with these shields much more effectively than others, so you may want to change out your loadout before doing this dungeon. Breaking the shield allows Stormrider Vokmar to take off 20% of the boss's health in a single strike, as well as stunning the boss for a short time. Throughout the encounter, the boss is also going to send out void chunks of the boss that will need to be focused down by players at all times. If you don't destroy the void chunks, they transform into a much more dangerous enemy, so you want to be sure to get on them as soon as possible. Another ability the boss is going to do is Unleash Corruption, where certain marked players want to take out their marked abilities out away from the rest of the group in order to avoid cleaving down any of your party members. In the Mythic version of this boss, you will simply just get a bit more void chunks, but the fight is pretty chaotic even without the Mythic difficulty. The next dungeon is going to be Cinderbrew Meadery, starting with Brewmaster Aldrier. For Brewmaster Aldrier is going to be a very simple fight where boss is going to be tossing hot brew around everywhere. You'll want to avoid the boss's Blazing Belch frontal ability, and then tank will want to also be very careful with the Keck Smash ability, which is a tank buster that does a ton of damage and leaves even more hot honey underneath. Once the boss reaches 100 energy, you don't want to hit him. He basically takes no damage whatsoever. Instead, you'll actually want to play a minigame where you want to deliver brews at the front of the counter towards some of the patrons. Though be sure to avoid some of the angrier patrons because they'll stun you and deal a ton of damage, but you'll want to get all these brews to the patrons so you can continue the encounter. The next boss from there, you can either go to Bank Busby or IPA, and we'll talk about IPA first, but you can do either one of these two bosses in any order. IPA has a few abilities such as a bottoms up uppercut, which is the tank buster that does a ton of damage, but also it's going to knock back the tank. You also will have burning fermentation, where the boss will slather players in a burning mead that can be dispelled by the healer, but will deal a ton of damage if you can dispel it effectively. The boss will also summon Spouting Stouts, which will create brew drops that will slowly travel towards the boss's location. You'll want to eliminate these brew drops or control them as quickly as possible. Just make sure they don't touch the boss, because otherwise the boss gets a massive shield out of it, which will make the fight a lot more inconvenient. These adds, when destroyed, will leave oozing honey on the ground when they die that grows out for a little bit. But over time, this oozing honey does end up kind of retreating and dissipating, which will then reform back into brew drops on Mythic difficulty, which becomes a very much an ad management fight. For this encounter specifically, you may want to clear the entire boss room in order to have as much space as possible to deal with this encounter appropriately. The next boss on the list is Bank Busby. For this encounter, the boss is going to summon barrels of honey, which will attract ravenous cinder bees, which becomes a little bit of an ad management type of a fight. These bees will leap around and bleed players, so you'll want to eliminate them as soon as possible. When the bees are low on health, they become docile, allowing players to ride them, so you'll want to mount a bee and smash through the honey barrels in order to help clear them out. The boss also periodically casts Flutter Wing, which commands the bee that he is riding to flap its wings aggressively, pushing players away from the boss while doing a decent amount of group-wide damage. Honey Marinade is going to be the tank buster Mythic unique mechanic, where the bake is going to hit his current target, the tank, with flammable honey, and after 5 seconds the player will ignite an area where they're standing, leaving burning honey on the ground. You will want to make sure to keep any of the bees away from the honey, otherwise they'll eat it and become much tougher to deal with. The final boss is Goldie Baronbottom. The Goldie's room is going to be filled with Cinderbrew barrels, very similar to Bang Busby's, but these barrels have a bit of a different function. When one of these barrels explodes, it will send waves of fire in cardinal directions, so you want to be very careful when to position when breaking these barrels. And popping too many barrels at once will cause a stack and debuff fire effect on Mythic difficulty, so on Mythic you'll want to manage these barrels a little bit more carefully. One of the ways to manage these barrels will be Cash Cannon, which will be a big tank buster with a conal attack that the boss is going to aim at the tank. This ability will also break any Cinderbrew barrels caught in its path. Burning Ricochet will mark a few players for a Burning Ricochet attack, where the shot will actually ricochet to anything near the player, which can be barrels or other players. So you want to place these near a few barrels, but not too many at a time. Let It Hail is the boss ability where when she reaches 100 energy, she detonates all of the bombs all at once. So you'll want to try to clear all of these bombs to make sure that the Mythic stacking debuff doesn't overwhelm and kill the rest of your party. The next dungeon is Darkflame Cleft, starting with Old Waxbeard, which is a very fun fight that has a lot of hectic amounts of ads that will just keep summoning constantly. You'll want to watch out for the minecarts going through the middle rails, because that's where the minecarts are going to run through and ram through players, and this is where the ads are going to be summoned from. These ads can't be tanked, they just fixate on random players, but this mine is not OSHA certified. There's a lot of workplace hazards that can take care of them very quickly, like Reckless Charge, where Waxbeard will command Wick, his mount, to charge towards the furthest player in the room. This attack knocks everything back from players, as well as a ton of damage to all of the little ads that he summons. At the end of the charge, you'll get a cave-in, where boulders will rain from the sky. Be sure to avoid them, but if you can keep the kobolds in there, those abilities are also very deadly to them as well. Luring Candle is an ability where Waxbeard will throw a candle to light a random player on fire, forcing all laborers to fixate that player specifically. Players of fire will require a little bit more healing from the healer. Rockbuster is a tank buster that does a ton of damage but also increases your physical damage taken after the ability, so you want to make sure to have a defensive ready for after the ability strikes you. Underhanded Tactics is a mythic mechanic where laborers will be able to sneak away a dynamite card onto the tracks. If you see a card full of dynamite, you will want to destroy it within 20 seconds or it explodes, dealing a ton of group bite damage. The next boss will be Blaziken, which is a massive candle elemental. First of all, this boss does not move around, so the tank will need to stay next to the boss at all times, otherwise he just radiates group-wide damage. And the main mechanic for this boss is going to be candles and candle management. The boss is going to want to reignite candles, and some abilities will ignite candles, and some abilities are going to extinguish them. You don't necessarily want to have all candles lit, but you also don't want to be completely free of candles either, as the boss will use Enkindling Inferno to try to keep candles lit, dealing fire damage that will travel from the boss towards the candles, and you don't want to be caught in that frontal barrage. Wickerlight Barrage is another ability that is hurled at players, and players near candles will reignite candles, which can give you a little bit of safer spot to stand in to avoid the Enkindling Inferno ability. Dousing Breath is a group-wide ability that summons winds that hits every player while extinguishing all candles, which will want to reignite not to get hit by Enkindling Inferno. And Extinguishing Gust is a mythic-only mechanic that creates a wind that chases after a player for 30 seconds. These tornado winds will also extinguish any candles that touch, so you want to make sure not all the candles are lit to avoid inside flames, because it causes all lit candles to surge in heat, spreading fire patches and embers all throughout the ground. The more candles are lit, the more effective this ability is, so you want to make sure to manage your candles as best as humanly possible. The next boss is the Candle King, which creates eerie molds of all the players in the room. These wax statues cause fire damage to all players as long as these wax molds survive. Of mythic difficulty, these molds also create evil darkness that flows from statues, chasing after players and will stun them for 20 seconds if they reach them, so you want to take care of the statues as fast as possible while avoiding coming into contact with these dark evils. Darkflame Pickaxe will be an ability where a boss will mark one of the players to toss his Darkflame Pickaxe at them. This attack will collide with the first thing that it hits, so if it collides with a wax statue, it'll shatter it, so you want to make sure to use those statues to avoid the pickaxe. Paranoid Mind is a cast that the boss will do that's interruptible, but if he gets it off, it's going to be an attack that's going to place the casted out player into a fear effect that can be dispelled. Third Darkflame is another attack that Candle King is going to do, where he tosses candles at random players. These Darkflames can also hit wax statues, which will melt them, taking care of the statues, but also creating a pool of hot wax that you'll want to try not to stand in. So it's much better to clear out wax statues with a pickaxe if possible, but if you don't have enough pickaxes, or if you miss a few, then definitely use Darkflame in order to clear out the rest of the wax statues. And the final boss of this dungeon will be Darkness, which you'll actually encounter twice. The first one will be in a mini event where you're chasing away from darkness on a rail cart while throwing dynamite at the boss. During that time, try to throw as much dynamite at the boss in order to weaken it, because the weaker version of the boss is what you'll be encountering for the part 2. The actual part 2, or the actual boss fight, is going to be managing light around darkness. Smothering shadows surround the boss arena, and standing in pure darkness reduces all damage and healing by 99%. Players will have to find candles all throughout the boss arena and keep them close to all of the players in order to make sure to keep the smothering shadows away. Candles can also be affected by certain abilities like adds as well as boss attacks, so you'll want to actually use the extra action button to move these candles off to the side. For those of you that have done Shriekwing encounter back in Shadowlands, it's essentially Shriekwing just repackaged as a boss encounter. During the fight on Mythic difficulty, the boss is going to use an ability called Eternal Darkness, which just unleashes waves of pure shadow damage, which will deal quite a bit of AoE damage and will reduce the candle's heat over time. The boss also calls Darkspawn, which can be interrupted, but if not interrupted, these sides will walk towards the candle to try to snuff it out, so you should use AoE abilities and positional attacks and interrupts and stuns in order to prevent the adds from killing out your candle. Umbra Slash is an ability where the boss will actually turn towards the candlelight and attempt to slash at it. Make sure to move the candle out of front of the Umbra Slash ability. Shadow Blast is an effect that marks one of the players for a Shadow Blast. Essentially, with this ability, you'll want to run out of the group and make sure that the AoE Shadow Blast does not clip the candle as well. Now the final non-seasonal dungeon of War Within is going to be Priory of the Sacred Flame, starting with Captain Dalcry. For this fight, you are going to have the entire courtyard of the Priory of the Sacred Flame surrounded by trusted guards of Captain Dalcry. And as you eliminate officers, the bodyguards of Dalcry are going to come to investigate it. Essentially, you want to try to keep Dalcry with as little of guards as possible, because the more guards are around him, the harder the encounter is going to be. So you want to run around slaying all the officers to make sure to peel away the defenses of Dalcry little by little. However, he'll always keep one of these guards with him at all times, and it seems to be a bit of a random rotation. For these guards, they're not all that difficult. Eliana does a lot of healing and casts Repentance that needs to be interrupted. Shane Maul does big blades and a big AoE ability that you'll want to avoid. And Dual Maul does a lot of fire damage, most of it can also be interrupted. But for the most part, none of these adds are really all that scary. As for the boss, however, there are a couple of mechanics. The boss is mounted on a cat called Ember, and will command Ember to Savage Maul one of the players in your party, immobilizing them, dealing damage over time. During that time, the boss is going to get a shield that needs to be broken as soon as possible in order to break the mauling effect. Dalcry will also cast a Battle Cry, which is a big AoE effect that does a ton of damage, ignoring players' armor, doing pure physical damage. This ability also inspires all of Dalcry's allies, granting them additional energy and increasing their damage done. And this effect keeps stacking, and you'll want to interrupt this ability at all times. Hurl Spear is going to be an attack where Dalcry is going to hurl his spear at a player, and the spear will pierce everything that heads between Dalcry and his target, putting a massive bleed effect. So avoid the spear frontal and try to manage the bleed as best as possible. Pierce Armor is going to be an attack that Dalcry is going to use against the tank, where he slashes the tank, doing a bunch of damage and applying a bleed, but the bleeding effect keeps on stacking. The next boss is going to be Baron Braunpike, who is essentially a paladin, and if you've ever played a paladin before, he essentially has all of the basic paladin abilities. With Braunpike being a paladin, from time to time he's going to use wings, and literally have wings of a paladin called Vindictive Wrath in order to empower certain abilities. So you'll want to manage the base version of abilities, but also the empowered versions. Castigated Shield is an ability where Braunpike hurls a holy shield at a few players, doing holy damage and slowing those players. Empowered version of the shield hits all 5 players. Burning Light is an interruptible ability, but if he does go off, it causes Holy Light to deal damage to everybody in the group for over 12 seconds. This Burning Light also will heal Braunpike, which is a big no-no. While Empowered Burning Light is actually going to have a reduced cast time, which makes it a much tighter of a kick spot, so you want to be sure to have your kicks in order as best as possible. Hammer of Purity is another ability where Braunpike will mark a player, and in that player's location he will send out spinning hammers, which will keep kind of spiraling outwards, hitting players all in its path. These hammers are generally easy to dodge. However, the empowered version of this ability will mark all players with hammers, which will make it a little bit harder for you to do a lot of the dodging. And the final boss is going to be Priorus Merprey, who has a handful of abilities, like Holy Smite, which does a bunch of damage, but it is very interruptible. This ability should not be interrupted immediately, but the empowered version of this ability definitely should. Holy Flame is another ability where she calls down a ray of light at a player's location. This effect, however, can be dispelled by the healer. Inner Fire is going to be kind of like a PI for the boss, where she essentially is empowered by the Sacred Flame, increasing holy damage by 50% for 10 seconds. This is where you'll want to make sure to interrupt Holy Smites as best as possible. While empowered, the boss also radiates Holy Fire, doing damage to the group every 2.5 seconds. With the ability of Sacred Flame, the boss is going to call down a ray of searing fire to chase after a player. This ray will also leave pools of sanctified ground on the floor, and you'll want to try to utilize all the space you can in the boss arena in order to try to keep this sacred fire away from the rest of the group. Blinding Light is a mythic only mechanic where the boss is going to unleash a dazzling light that will disorient all players looking at the boss. So you'll want to make sure to actually turn your character physically away from the boss to make sure you don't get blinded by the ability. When the boss hits 50% health, she's going to gain a Barrier of Light, where the boss is going to move to the second floor of the boss arena and be protected, channeling an ability that deals continuous damage over time. You want to break through her shield as soon as possible and interrupt her channel in order to reduce as much of the holy damage as possible. And throughout this encounter, the boss will also summon adds. These adds are empowered by the Sacred Flame as well, radiating holy damage around them, which means you either want to keep those adds away from you or you want to eliminate them as soon as possible. The Sacred Flame, however, however, will burn these hats' health away every 1 second, so keeping them away will allow Sacred Flame to just burn these hats over time. So if you have classes with a lot of crowd control, they can keep all these crowds away from the group so you can focus on the shield. This is where some of those talents can actually help with that encounter a little. Next, I want to go over some of the seasonal War Within dungeons that will be available during Mythic Plus Season 1, starting out with some of the Nerubian dungeons such as Ara-Kara, the City of Echoes. The first boss is going to be Avonox the Insatiable, and Avonox is going to be, throughout the encounter, doing mostly a lot of AoE damage, but before the encounter, you'll actually be able to kill some of the Nerubian officers that will actually mimic some of the boss's attacks, so you'll be a little bit more familiar with what Avonox will be utilizing as part of the encounter. But also take note of the massive room that leads to the boss arena. That entire room is essentially the boss arena, and you may end up moving Avonox around that entire place on higher key difficulties in order to manage and keep up with some of the boss mechanics. For Avonox is going to start out the encounter with an alerting shrill, which will release starved crawlers from the eggs walking towards one of the players. During this time, you'll want to make sure to eliminate all of those crawlers as quickly as possible, or at the very best, try to keep them as far away from the boss, because otherwise the boss is going to leap on top of the crawlers and eat them, gaining the buff of Insatiable, increasing the boss's damage by 50% for essentially the rest of the encounter, making it much harder than it needs to be. When it comes to the Tank Buster, the boss is going to hit you with a Voracious Bite, which does 3 consecutive bites, each doing a few million damage and increasing your damage taken by 50% for 10 seconds. So you'll definitely want to make sure to have some kind of a defensive or an external to survive the Voracious Bite. Shortly around the time you start to defeat the Adzor and they start to get a little bit lower, the boss will begin Gossamer Onslaught, leaving webs falling from the sky all around the boss arena, leaving puddles of webbing on the floor. You want to make sure to avoid both the webbing puddles as well as the swirlies underground to try to take as little AoE damage as possible. And because of Gossamer Onslaught and the vile webbings left on the ground is why you want to move the boss all around the boss arena. Both Gossamer Onslaught as well as Alerting Shrill will do a ton of group-wide damage, so as a healer you'll want to be very careful and save some kind of a defensive or a group external in order to survive both of these attacks. The next boss is going to be a noob, Zect, who will target players with Infestation, calling a swarm to feast upon players, doing quite a bit of nature damage over 5 seconds. And upon removal, this ability will then transform into a ceaseless swarm that will kind of float all around the boss arena, hunting down random players. The main two big abilities you'll want to shout for is Burrow Charge, where a noob Zect is going to burrow and then target a random player, charging towards them, knocking them back along the path. Then the boss will turn around, erupting spikes outwards, which will deal a ton of damage, knocking players back. A similar mechanic can be observed when the boss targets the tank with the ability of Impale, which will be yet another one of those frontal linear attacks that has the potential of knocking players back, so the tank will want to try to phase this away from everybody else. This will become, however, much more difficult when the boss reaches 100 energy, where he'll use the ability Eye of the Swarm, where the boss will give you a much more limited window of where you can stand on the boss platform, so avoiding a lot of the abilities as well as the swarms is going to be much harder. On Mythic difficulty, the boss is also going to integrate Blunt-Stained Web Mages, which will use an ability called Silken Restraints, rooting the player in place, allowing for the boss to have an easier time hitting you with all of the knockback and frontal attacks. The final boss of this dungeon is going to be Kai Katal the Harvester, where there's a handful of mechanics involved. Throughout this fight, you will encounter blood workers carrying black blood all across the boss arena. You want to make sure to hit a few of them with an ability. You don't necessarily need to kill them, you just need to hit them hard enough so they drop the black blood on the ground, because you'll be using that later. The boss is going to have a lot of AoE group-wide abilities such as Erupting Webs, which very similar to Avonox, it'll be a lot of webs falling from the sky that you'll want to avoid. The boss is also going to poison players, with this poison getting different effects, with the strongest one being on Mythic difficulty. All other difficulties, it's just a poison that deals some damage, but on Mythic difficulty, it's a cultivated poison that will also erupt forth waves of poison that will travel from the player location. When you get targeted by cultivated poison, you'll actually see 2 cones emanating from the player, kind of showing where those waves are going to be aimed at, and you can control where your player is facing in order to control which way those waves are going to go. Essentially, as a player, you want to dodge these waves as best as possible, but if you get marked by this ability and you could face it away from the group, that could also be very helpful. At some point through the encounter, the boss is going to cast Cosmic Singularity, which is going to pull all players towards the boss. At first, the pull is going to be a little bit weak until it yoinks you right to the boss. This is why, to avoid this ability, you'll want to step into Black Blood to get rooted by Grasping Blood, where you'll see a congealed pool of black blood actually rooting you in place. You'll either need to kill this Grasping Blood, or you'll want to crowd control it with any ability in order to break the root effect, in order to avoid the webs that will be raining down from the sky upon you shortly. So having some kind of a group CC or a group defensive or any kind of crowd control ability at the ready just to break out of the root effect is advisable. The next dungeon is going to be City of Threads, another Nerubian dungeon with the first boss, Orator Krex Visk. Now, the Orator is a very private Nerubian that prefers a more close-knit company, and that means you won't be able to get away from the boss too far, otherwise you get yoinked back to his location. So while you have quite a bit of room to work with, your space when dealing with the boss is actually quite restrained. The Orator is going to use a tank buster ability of Subjugate, which will deal partial shadow damage, partial physical damage to the tank, also slowing down the movement for 10 seconds. The boss is also going to mark 2 players with Shadows of Doubt. When dispelled, these shadows will actually spiral out from the player's location, and you'll actually see spikes of which direction these shadows will spiral out of you. You want to make sure to dispel these accordingly, or position yourselves where when these shadows erupt, they don't hit other players, otherwise it will deal a ton of damage and will stun them for a few seconds. During that time, the boss is also going to use a frontal of Terrorize, making it much harder for you to position around to aim those shadows of doubt more accordingly. After a short bit of time, the Orator is going to hit players with the Litany of Dark Propaganda, which will deal erupting shadow damage, which the healer will want to manage. Afterwards, the boss will leave an area of lingering influence on the ground, which as a group you'll want to travel away from. So the tank and everybody else will want to travel with the boss all the way to the same side in order to move out of the area of lingering influence. The next boss is called Fangs of the Queen, where you'll be dealing with Nyx and Vix. At least that's how I think that you say their names, or that's how I'm going to refer to them for this video specifically. Nyx and Vix have 2 different empowerment stages. The first empowerment is going to empower Nyx specifically, where he's going to be essentially the ad that you want to tank at all times. Nyx is going to use a Shade Slash ability, which is a big frontal that looks deceptively wide, but it's actually kind of easy to avoid for other players. Though every single one of these shade slashes will leave an echoing shade, so every time he slashes, every one of the echoes is also going to do a slash as well. At some point, Nyx is going to use Dustbringer, which will create a bunch of void zones all on the ground, where some players will want to step back in order to be sure to avoid it. During that time, Vix, who doesn't really do much up until this point, uses Ice Sickles, shooting out spikes of ice from his direction to every one of the players. During that mechanic, just make sure no 2 players are standing on top of each other to not get hit by 2 icicles, since it targets every single player and flies right through you. After that, once the bosses reach 100 energy, they'll go into Synergetic Step, where they'll meet together and will slash around all throughout the boss arena, making them a little bit harder to target. Then they'll transfer their power from Nyx onto Vix, where then the tank will want to maintain Vix's attention at all times. During that time, Vix is going to be attacking the tank with Rhyme Dagger, which will want to make sure it doesn't hit everybody else, but only you. But also, you want to try to keep Vix next to Nyx, who will be teleporting periodically, and Nyx will attack the closest enemy next to him, so if it's another player that isn't the tank, that could then create a lot of danger. During this time, when Nyx casts Dustbringer, you'll essentially will want to back away from all the void zones as well, but Vix is going to get a new ability called Freezing Blood, where they're going to put a ring of ice around the tank. Other players need to stand next to the tank to help warm them up, otherwise you'll be frozen solid, but if enough players stand next to Freezing Blood, it'll eventually dissipate without freezing the tank. The next boss is going to be a Coagulation. For this boss, he's going to summon Vicious Darkness. The boss will slam on the ground, knock the players back, and start drawing in coagulated versions of black blood towards him. If these versions of black blood reach the boss, he'll restore 7% of his maximum health. But players can stand before those black bloods and absorb them, which will give him a healing absorption effect instead. Essentially, the healer is going to have to heal throughout absorption effect on everybody in their group, but certain classes that have good self-healing, like Demon Hunters for example, will be able to deal with this mechanic a little bit easier due to all of that leech damage healing. The boss is going to hit the tank with an Oozing Smash, doing a bunch of shatter damage, but also reducing their healing received by 30%, which will make it a little bit harder for tanks to pick up these orbs, unless you're heal-heavy tanks like Blood Death Knights or Guardian Druids. On Mythic difficulty, the boss is also going to smash the ground, creating more pools of ground that you'll want to manage and control. Essentially, you want to kite the boss around the boss arena in a circle to try to keep away from the black blood that keeps growing over time. Upon reaching 100 energy, the boss is going to thrash violently, releasing dark energy that inflicts a bunch of shadow damage every second to all players. The final boss of City of Threads is Izzo, the Grand Splicer. And essentially Izzo is, if you played League of Legends, she's essentially Syndra. She has the same mechanic as Syndra, where she'll create these void orbs, and she'll keep moving them around from time to time after a handful of mechanics, and you'll want to avoid those orbs while cutting the boss around in a circle, very similar to the previous boss encounter. For the boss fight, she's going to mark random players with Splice, doing a ton of shadow damage to them, so that'll be someone for the healer to watch out for. Otherwise, Izzo is going to splice her own genes in order to transform into different monstrosities. With Tremor Slam, she's going to transform into a Nerubian Lord, slamming in a massive area all around her, so you want to take a step back, while also unleashing Ravenous Scarabs. These Scarabs use an ability of Gorge, which will do a nice bit of physical damage to its target, and after 5 Gorges, it'll trigger Gut Burst, causing these Scarabs to explode. Essentially, you either want to keep the Scarabs away from you or eliminate them as soon as possible to avoid the Gut Burst ability. At some point, Izzo will also transform into a Nerubian Sage, which will essentially use the Umbral Weave ability to root all players in place with the Shadow Webs. However, the Shadow Webs can be targeted by damage, so you want to break them as soon as possible before she moves all those Void Orbs, killing you in the process. And after she does both transformations of Nerubian Sage and the Nerubian Crypt Lord, she'll use the ability Process of Elimination, which is a massive tank buster, where she'll pick up those Void Orbs and will chuck them at the tank, all 3 of them back to back to back. During this mechanic, the tank will want to take a step back and use a defensive in order to reduce damage taken, but also by taking a step back, he allows the melee and other players to keep DPSing the boss while not getting hit by the tank frontal. This tank frontal in particular happens very quickly, so you want to be very quick to take a step back and press the defensive to avoid hitting any of your group members. Now the next dungeon is going to be Dawnbreaker, which is kind of like a dynamic riding dungeon, where you'll be able to use your flying mount in order to traverse for a portion of the encounter. And the first fight actually allows you to utilize this as part of the boss mechanics versus Speaker Shadowcrown. For Speaker Shadowcrown, she has a couple of abilities, such as an Obsidian Beam, which will send out beams that will rotate all around players. At first she'll have 3 beams, and then later down she'll have 4 beams. You want to make sure to avoid these beams as best as possible. Try to keep the boss positions towards the front of the boat or the back of the boat and moving back and forth, or you can go the left side of the boat or right side, or rather starboard or broadside, whichever way you want to use it. Because during that time, the boss will use Collapsing Night, opening up void portals at a handful of players' locations for 30 seconds, and these void portals will grow in time. So you want to move the boss to the front of the ship, drop void portals, then drag the boss to the back of the ship to make sure you have plenty of space to dodge the beam. Periodically, the boss will also use an ability called Burning Shadows, debuffing one of the players, doing a ton of shadow damage to them until dispelled. Once dispelled, however, Burning Shadows will be split and reapplied to 4 players. And I'll apply the debuff of Shadow Shroud to 4 players, which the healer is going to have to heal through in order to remove. The boss will also cast Shadow Bolt ability, which can be interrupted and should be interrupted whenever you need to move the boss quickly. When the boss reaches 50% health, she's going to cast Darkness Comes, literally creating an orb of void to destroy everything around her. During that time, you'll want to mount up and fly around the ship, picking up radiant light so you can stay up in the sky much longer. As soon as the cast of Darkness Comes is over, then you'll want to fly back onto the ship to finish out the boss. She does the Darkness Comes ability twice, once at 50% health and once when she's finally defeated, so you want to be very quick to mount up and fly out to get out of the danger away from Darkness Comes. The next boss is going to be a Noob Ikaj, but before you can eliminate the boss, you'll want to take down some of his loyal officers that will actually mimic some of the boss's abilities, such as the Dark Orb, which is going to conjure a sphere of pure darkness that will be targeted at a player. Once the sphere is created, it will travel slowly towards the player's last known location, and it'll keep going forward. When this orb reaches its endpoint, like a wall or anything like that, it will explode, but the damage of the orb is decreased the further away that it travels from the group. So it will make sure to send these orbs as far as possible, so when they explode, they don't hit anybody else. You'll want to also avoid getting hit by the orb itself, because the orb is going to leave a pretty nasty dot on the player that gets hit by the orb. Another mechanic these officers will do, that the old boss will also do, is a Terrifying Slam, which is primarily a tank buster mechanic, where the boss will target the tank, doing a ton of physical damage and apportion shadow damage to them, knocking them back in the process. Any allies caught in a blast that aren't the tank will also be feared and running into random direction for 3 seconds, so you want to make sure the tank is by themselves and not getting knocked into a bad area, in order to be able to avoid Terrifying Slam accordingly. The boss and the officers also use an ability called Shadow Decay, which as they channel, the ability actually grows stronger and stronger the longer that they channel it. Shadow's Decay does erupting shadow damage to everybody around you, which the healer will want to be very, very careful of. But a new Bikash does have its own ability of Animate Shadows, where he'll create more shadows that will congeal and summon and will try to cast Congealed Darkness ability, which can be interrupted or stunned. All you have to do is kill the ads before they get the cast of that ability. Now the final fight is going to be Rush Nan, which is a bit of a gimmick fight. You don't necessarily need to do a lot of boss damage in order to be able to defeat this encounter. It's mostly a mechanics fight than anything. At the very start, Rush Nan is going to do a couple of things, like corrode the group so they take a bunch of nature damage, and expel webs in a straight line, which you'll want to avoid as best as possible. One of the players in the group is going to be marked with Rolling Acid, which will send out a wave that you'll be able to kind of see the animation for when you immediately get marked on in which direction the wave is going to go, either to the left of you or to the right of you. Essentially, you want to try to put this wave away from the group so it doesn't roll over your entire party. And during phase 1, in the back of the ship of the Dawnbreaker, a Nightfallen bomber is going to be placing down barrels of Arathi bombs. All DPS classes will want to go back to pick up these bombs, take it to the boss, and then chuck the bombs at the boss because they'll do roughly 6% of boss's health in damage. If you don't do that, then the bombs explode, dealing group-wide damage to the rest of your party. After you drop a couple of bombs at the boss is actually going to try to flee away from you, and you'll want to mount up on your skywriting mount in order to chase after the boss. The easiest way to do so is to fly towards the center of town and then literally follow the boss exactly as they are. When the boss lands, you begin the second part of the encounter, which is very, very similar as the first. You'll still have a lot of poison damage, as well as rolling waves and strains of web that'll be shooting out away from the boss. However, 2 players are also going to get hit by spinneret strands, where you'll want to take those back away from the group, get hit by them, and then you'll want to run out of the sticky webs and break the strand, which will do a bit of damage for the healer to manage. But for most of it, it's still all about managing the poison, managing the waves, and not managing those spinneret strands. Now the next dungeon we have is Stonevault, starting with Edna. And Edna is going to have a handful of unique mechanics. For most of the group members, DPS and healers, you'll be spawning volatile spikes all throughout the encounter. Try to make sure not to spawn these 2 spikes too close to one another, just to make sure that you can clear them with a beam later. The boss is going to target players with a refracting beam, which will clear those volatile spikes. You'll want to clear those spikes just to make sure that you don't get overwhelmed by them, but you also want to make sure you don't remove 2 spikes with a single beam. Otherwise, that is a lot for one healer to heal. You can either have every player clear a spike or at least leave 1 spike alive if you're having a struggle healing through this part of the encounter. Eventually, after a few rounds of volatile spikes and refractive beams, the boss is going to cast Earth Shatter, which will erupt all active spikes at once. So if you have way too many spikes out at the same time, that's going to be way too much for one healer to handle. Besides this, the boss is going to absolutely obliterate your tank with the Seismic Smash ability, with just a metric ton of physical damage. So for the very first smash as a tank, you'll want to make sure almost every single one of your major defensives is used in order to take the very first punch. After the first punch, the tank is going to be affected by Seismic Reverberation, a debuff that you don't want to dispel too early as a healer. While the tank has the debuff, they will take some nature damage every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. But the healer will want to save their dispel for the next Seismic Smash, because when the tank is dispelled with Seismic Reverberation, they actually get the buff of Stone Shield, which reduces their damage taken by 50% for 6 seconds. So this mechanic becomes really just a dance between the tank and the healer to manage the Seismic Smash and Seismic Reverberation debuffs. And while nobody really wants to give healer a hard time in dungeons, if the tank is not living through Edna's Seismic Smash ability, there's a good chance that the healer may actually be at fault and may be dispelling a little too early. The next 2 bosses can actually be done in any order, but you'll still need to do both of them in order to proceed to the final boss. One of those 2 bosses is going to be Skarmorak. During this encounter, the boss is going to use a crystalline smash on the tank, shattering the ground area, which you'll want to avoid. And every single one of these shatters will create a crystalline shard. These crystal shards need to be eliminated as quickly as possible, but you don't want to kill all of them at once. In fact, you actually want to stagger them and focus one at a time as best as you can. Throughout this encounter, the boss is also going to do Unstable Crash, which will create more fragments of shadow that you don't want to pick up just yet. You actually do want to use those fragments of shadow, but a little bit later. Throughout the encounter, continue to dodge the crystalline smash tank ability while killing off crystal shards as fast as possible. After 2 crystalline smashes, shortly after, the boss is going to use Fortified Shell ability, where you'll consume all crystalline shards to empower a shield. The more crystalline shards it consumes, the bigger that shield is going to be. While the shield is active, the boss is going to radiate with a void discharge, which will grow in power over time, dealing more and more shadow damage until the healer is overwhelmed. To deal with that shield effectively, this is where players, DPS, tanks, and healers want to pick up unstable fragments of the void, which will give you the buff of unstable energy. Healers will gain 50% more healing from this effect, while DPS and tanks will be able to deal 50% more damage to the Fortified Shell debuff. Tanks in particular that have a good defensive may pick up multiple fragments at once in order to increase the effectiveness of this ability, since unstable energy does stack. The next boss is going to be Master Machinist, where you have 2 machine speakers that have 2 different roles and 2 different abilities for you to play around with. First is going to be the small guy called Speaker Brock. Speaker Brock's main ability is going to be Molten Metal, which you'll want to interrupt pretty regularly, otherwise he'll deal group-wide damage. Speaker Brock's main second ability is going to be Scrap Song, where he'll jump to the left or the right side of the room and create a massive cube of scrap, then hurl it across the entire boss arena. You'll want to make sure not to be in front of the cube, otherwise it's an immediate one-shot. Periodically, Speaker Brock is also going to channel energy set up in the corners of the center of the boss arena. The vents that are spouting flames are going to be left with flaming scrap. Essentially, vents that have been set ablaze are not safe, while the other vents that didn't have any fire shoot out of them are safer vents. This will be important to deal with the other machine speaker. The other machine speaker is Speaker Dorlita, which will be primarily focusing on the tank, hitting him with Igneous Hammer, which does a ton of pure fire damage. Speaker Dorlita is also going to focus down on a random player and fire off a lava cannon, sending out a lava orb in their direction, which you'll want to simply avoid as best as possible. Shortly after, Speaker Brock creates a scrap cube to send across the arena floor. Dorlita is going to run over to the scrap cube and then drag it towards the center of the boss arena, heating it up, overcharging it, and causing it to get destroyed, sending out lava waves in cardinal directions. So the front, the back, the left, and the right hand side of the room will not be safe. However, the vents will be a safe spot for you to utilize. So you want to make sure to stand on one of the safer vents that haven't been hit with exhaust by Speaker Brock. Also, I completely forgot, but I'm adding this in the editing studio, that the bosses actually also have an enrage mechanic. You want to keep them as even as possible. If one of the bosses dies before the other, the boss that is still alive is going to enrage, while the dead boss is now going to pulsate with fire damage, making them fight a little bit harder than having to deal with both of these bosses at the same time. The final boss of this dungeon is going to be Void Speaker Eric, who has a handful of void-based abilities. One of them is going to be Unbridled Void, which is a simple conal ability that you'll want to avoid as best as possible. Another effect is going to be Entropic Reckoning, where he'll mark every single player with a cacophony of void energy, and after a bit of time, it'll leave a zone of entropy on that player. Essentially, you'll want to try to manage those void zones as best as possible throughout the room, just to make sure you're not blocked off by the edges of the boss arena. Eric is also going to mark players with a void corruption, which you want to take to a void rift as early as possible. By standing next to a void rift, your corruption will actually be siphoned out into the rift. Then that rift is going to close and a new rift is going to spawn somewhere on the edges of the room. So you want to utilize the boss room as best as possible, not blocking out the area for these void rifts, so you can get to them as quickly as possible to transfer your void corruption into the rift. The longer you hold on to your void corruption, the more damage it's going to do over time. So getting rid of your corruption is going to be of utmost importance for this encounter. Now, the last 4 Season 1 dungeons are actually going to be non-War Within dungeons, as they're going to be following a very similar pattern of doing some expansion dungeons and returning dungeons as they did in the seasons for Dragonflight. One of those returning dungeons are going to be 2 from the expansion of Shadowlands. The first is going to be Miss Tirna Sai, starting with a fight of Ingra Malak. During this encounter, you'll be fighting both Ingra Malak as well as Droman Offerman, as Droman Offerman is controlled by Ingra Malak up until Droman hits 20% health. Your main priority is going to be at the beginning of the encounter is to attack Droman until you can get him to 20% health, but both bosses can be cleaved. Periodically you want to interrupt Ingram Lock Spirit Bolt ability, as it does quite a solid bit of damage. Throughout the fight, the boss is also going to hit the entire group with Repulsive Visage, which is a non-interruptible fear effect that can be avoided if you have abilities such as Tremor Totem on a Shaman. Eventually, Ingram Lock is going to use Embrace Darkness, which is going to reduce the amount of damage he takes, so focusing down Droman Overman is going to be utmost important. Once Droman hits 20% health, he breaks free of his mind control, turns on Ingram Lock, and strangles him in vines, increasing the amount of damage that Ingra takes by quite a bit, so you'll want to save all of your cooldowns during those specific windows. The next boss for this dungeon is going to be Mistcaller, and before Mistcaller, while doing the maze, you'll play a bit of a find an odd one out minigame, where you want to find the icon or a shape, or a combination of shapes rather, that is not like the rest. Either one of them will have a circle, or one will not have a circle, one will either be a leaf or a flower, or it'll maybe be filled in, or it'll be translucent. So that minigame will still come into play when you're doing the Mistcaller encounter, specifically the intermission fights. Throughout this fight though, the Mistcaller will play games with you, such as Dodgeball, which will send balls for everybody to dodge, and these balls will target every single one of the players, doing damage in a straight line. The tank is going to have to play Patty Cake with the boss, which is going to be the only interrupting mechanic that only the tank can interrupt. Other DPS and healers cannot interact with this mechanic whatsoever. The boss is also going to play Freeze Tag, creating an illusionary Vulpin to chase after a player. You can either destroy this Vulpin, but getting too close to it will trigger its freeze effect. So the best way to deal with it is to root it, knock it back, crowd control it, polymorph with fear, whatever you can, or even just to slow it, just to make sure it gets out of the way. Death Knight's using the ability of Abomination Limb will have to be very careful with using this ability, because you could easily group the Illusionary Vulpin into the group, stunning everybody and preparing everybody for potential death through either Dodgeball or Patty Cake. When the boss hits certain health thresholds, you'll trigger the effect of Guessing Game, where the boss will create multiple illusions of her with an icon above their heads. Essentially what you have to do is find the odd one out and defeat that illusionary clone in order to get past the Guessing Game intermission. During Guessing Game, the boss takes 0 damage, so just focus on illusionary clones as best as possible. Now the final boss is going to be Tredova, which actually did get one new mechanic for this expansion that it did not have back during the expansion of Shadowlands. Throughout the encounter, the boss is going to use Acid Expulsion, which will glob acid spit all throughout the encounter. This Acid Expulsion ability is going to gain intensity as the encounter goes on. Periodically, the boss is going to use Accelerated Incubation, spawning Gormling larvae, and will use a Marked Prey ability to have all those Gormlings fixate a specific player, where you will want to use crowd control abilities in order to keep that player alive as best as possible. Every so often, the boss is going to link players with a Mind Link, tethering everybody to the tank. While tethered together, players will take continuous shadow damage every second until you can break the tether by getting far enough from the player. All players will always be tethered to the tank, so you can position yourself ahead of this ability to make sure that you can break the tether as quickly as possible. Right after the boss is using the Mind Link ability, she goes on with a new ability that has been added for this expansion called Coalescing Poison, where Tredova will gather poison onto itself while pulling players closer to her little by little. This concentrated poison will do a ton of damage after 5 seconds, so you want to make sure you're at least 15 yards away from the boss to avoid the impact. When the boss reaches certain health thresholds, she'll then begin consuming the cocoon of Lakali, which will cause anima to erupt out of the cocoon, which will deal massive group-wide damage, creating a ton of puddles and constant AoE for the healer and the group to manage. During this time, you'll want to attack the boss to break her Gorging Shield and interrupt the boss as soon as possible to break the Consumption ability. And every time the boss uses Consumption, the boss actually gets smarter every time she gets to consume the cocoon of Lakali. This is going to affect how Acid Expulsion is going to function. At first, the boss is also always just going to mark Acid Expulsion on almost random locations or try to hit players as best as possible. After the first consumption, these Acid Expulsions will actually try to be a bit more smarter and even at times more predictable. By the time the boss consumes Lakali a second time, these Acid Expulsions are going to be more numerous and will actually try to guess where the players are going to go. So the boss actually gets a little bit smarter, but creates even more Acid Expulsions, making it a much more of a dangerous mechanic. From there on, the next Shadowlands dungeon is going to be Necrotic Wake, starting with the boss of Blightbone. Blightbone and the entire dungeon of Necrotic Wake is actually a very simple encounter. The tank is going to have to care for the boss ability of Crunch, which will just do a ton of tank damage. Periodically, the boss is going to mark one of the players under Heaving Wretch and will send out a frontal cone of acid to spew at that player. So you want to try to position yourself away from everybody else to make sure you don't hit other players with a Heaving Wretch. Every time the boss uses a Heaving Wretch, it'll spawn 3 carrion worms that will fixate on a random player and try to gorge on them. If these worms gorge on players too much, they'll end up exploding, which will deal a ton of group-wide damage, so you want to defeat these carrion worms as soon as possible before they gorge on a player 5 times. After any of the worms die, they'll leave on the ground fetid gas, which will do a ton of damage to an area and will be essentially an area of silence where players can't use spells or abilities while standing in gas. The boss is also going to be using the fetid gas ability as well, which will create more areas where you just can't stand and use abilities, so you'll want to clear out the boss room a little bit to give yourself as much space as possible in order to be able to maneuver the boss around quite a bit to deal with the fetid gas more effectively. The next boss is going to be Amarth the Harvester, who will periodically cast the ability of Necrotic Bolt, which will not only do shatter damage to either target, but also will leave an absorb effect on that target for absorption of health, so you want to interrupt that ability as best as possible. Periodically, the boss is also going to use Unholy Frenzy, and then go into a big frenzy, increasing attack speed by 40%, which will be quite deadly to the tank, but it is an enrage ability which can be cleared with class talents. On Mythic difficulty, the boss is also going to use a Necrotic Breath ability, where he commands his mount Bonefang to start channeling a frontal breath, and he'll either rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. That tends to really vary depending on the encounter. Periodically, the boss is going to summon the Land of the Dead, reanimating warriors, mages, and crossbowmen, which you'll want to try to interrupt and group up together as best as possible. Having a Death Knight for this dungeon specifically, or any class with a major knockback to group enemies better together, can be helpful. The main thing you'll want to focus on is on interrupting the animated mage's Frostbolt Volley ability in particular, because it does a ton of AoE damage, and the DPS will want to focus on the adds as soon as they spawn. Shortly after summoning all of these adds, the boss is going to use the ability of Final Harvest, where the boss harvests the bodies of all his minions, destroying them. If those minions are still alive, they explode for a ton of group-wide damage, but otherwise the corpse explosion doesn't really do any damage. Instead, it empowers the boss to deal a bit more shadow damage, which is a preferable method. Either way, make sure to stand back away from all the turquoise swirlies on the ground. The next boss is going to be Surgeon Stitchflesh, who won't be fighting you directly at first. Instead, he'll have you fighting his abominations, which will deal quite a considerable bit of damage to the tank, and over time they'll actually grow a little bit more powerful, while Surgeon Stitchflesh the entire time throws needles and everybody else bleeding out the rest of the group. What you'll want to do as a party is when somebody gets marked by the abomination for a hook ability, you want to aim the hook at Surgeon Stitchflesh's platform, and then move out of the way before the hook is sent at the boss. This is how you're going to be able to grab the boss from his platform down onto the boss floor, where you can actually attack him directly. Now, while fighting Surgeon Stitchflesh, at some point he'll begin to have morbid fixation on certain specific players, chasing after them until it reaches them and eliminate him immediately. During that time, you'll want to use that same chain hook ability from the abominations to aim at Surgeon Stitchflesh in order to be able to take him out of this morbid fixation trance. And you'll want to make sure to manage all these adds, because shortly after, the boss is going to jump back onto the platform, where you want to have another hook ability to grip him back down. And the group can easily get overrun with too many of these abominations, which start doing increasingly more and more damage the longer they are alive. And the last boss of Necrotic Wake will be Nalthor the Rime Binder, a frosty lich which deals a lot of what looks like magic damage, but a lot of it is physical and is manageable by the tank for the most part. The boss has a handful of abilities that are mostly AoE focused, such as a Comet Storm, where he'll rain down icy comets on each player's location, and you'll want to avoid them as best as possible. He'll mark a player with a Frozen Binds, which is going to create a blue circle around that player. Dispelling a Frozen Bind does free the player, but any other players within that blue circle area will then get rerouted, so you want to make sure to get clear of the person with a Frozen Bind. On Mythic difficulty, the boss is also going to surround himself with an Icebound Aegis, which will create him a fairly meaty shield that will need to be broken. While the shield holds, it'll deal constant AoE damage to all allies around you, with the damage stacking little by little. Throughout this encounter, the boss is going to send players out into an Icy Exile, which will have those players running through a bit bit of a gauntlet, avoiding frigid storms, frigid colds, and blizzards, trying to make their way over to the Gilded Champion on the other side and defeating Azorima's Siphoner. You'll want to make sure to have an interrupt or stun available for the Siphoner, because it'll do a channel to try to enfeeble you and make you weaker, and you want to eliminate that Azorima Siphoner as quickly as possible and get through the gauntlet as quickly as you can. After freeing the Gilded Champion, they'll take it back onto the boss platform. And after leaving the gauntlet, the players, the longer time they spend in the gauntlet, the more stacks they'll have of Frigid Cold. After a little bit of time after leaving the gauntlet, shortly after landing on a platform, they'll drop Razor Shard Ice on the ground. You'll want to take it to one of the corners of the boss arena, drop the shard, and sprint out of there as quickly as possible to escape the Razor Shard Ice, because it does a ton of damage. It will limit the space you have when it comes to the boss arena. The faster you get through the gauntlet, the smaller that area of effect frost damage is going to be. After escaping the gauntlet, the Gilded Champion will actually grant you Champion's boon buff, increasing your critical strike chance by 100% for 40 seconds. So if you want to save your cooldowns for after you get sent to the gauntlet to combine together with the cooldowns, that will allow you to have more efficient time at defeating Nathro the Rime Binder. Now the next non-War Within dungeon is going to be Siege of Boralus from the expansion of Battle for Azeroth, and this has gone through a bit of changes where they mix the Alliance of the Horde version of this dungeon as well as the bosses a little bit more evenly. So a lot of the enemies as well as some of the bosses and some of their specific mechanics are going to be a mix of both factions versions. For the first boss, we have Chopper Redhook, who's going to be focusing players down, chasing after them until he reaches them. And Chopper Redhook is going to be chasing after a player until On the Hook channel is completely filled. If Chopper Redhook does not find a player or doesn't reach a player in enough time, he uses an Iron Hook ability, pulling all players to him before unleashing a Gore Crash, which will deal some massive heavy group-wide damage, but also a lot more damage around the boss's location. So if you do get hooked in, you want to run out as quickly as possible. Throughout this encounter, there's going to be cannibal barrages happening all throughout the dungeon, which will leave bombs on the floor. Essentially, you want to run Chopper Redhook through all those bombs to disorient him, making it take more damage for a limited time, while allowing the ranged players, which are usually going to be his on-the-hook focused targets, to position better to run him into another bomb. And essentially just want to run the boss from one bomb to the next and doing as much damage to him as possible, especially after he walks through a bomb. Throughout this encounter, you'll have two adds, an Iron-Tide Powder Shot, which deals random damage to one of the party members. The other is Iron-Tide Cleaver, which the tank will want to pick up and kite around as best as possible. Iron-Tide Cleavers will do a frontal ability called Heavy Slash, which will be a long-range frontal caster ability that will travel all throughout the boss room. Try to make sure you don't get hit by the Heavy Slash ability, otherwise you take a lot of physical damage and get stunned for 4 seconds. The next boss is going to be Captain Lockwood, which saw a few updates since their introduction back in Battle for Azeroth, and this fight is a little bit more structured and less over a randomized fiesta of encounter. The main mechanics you'll want to watch out for this boss is to keep her slowed at all times so she doesn't use the ability of evasive. So you want to make sure some kind of a passive slow or a passive root effect is on the boss at all times, which most classes can provide. If the boss is ever away from any of the melee classes, she starts using the ability of Gut Shot, which does a ton of physical damage. So the tank will want to get to the boss and slow him as quickly as possible. The boss also does a frontal ability called Clear the Deck, which is a frontal cone attack that will send all targets in front of you knocked backwards. Again, the tank will want to avoid it to make sure they can stay on the boss as best as possible. Periodically, the boss is also going to hit the party with a fire ricochet, which will slug at a target player and will kind of chain onto a handful of other players, doing plenty bit of fire damage over time, which is a very, very heal-heavy mechanic. Periodically, the boss is also going to call for a mass bombardment, where the players are going to hit by sided artillery, where artillery will kind of rain upon you, but you can do a little bit of the stutter step movement in order to plan where the artillery is going to go. At all times, though, the tank will want to stay next to the melee of the boss, so you can back away or drag the boss out, so you want to make sure to position yourself accordingly for the mass bombardment ability. And in fact, melee classes can actually stack together with the tank and move all around the boss little by little to make sure to avoid the mass bombardment ability. When the boss reaches 66 and 33% health, she'll instead withdraw towards her ship, sending out dread volleys from time to time, while letting you fight her Ashvane deckhands as well as Ashvane Cannoneer. All three of those adds need to be picked up by the tank immediately, and you want to focus on eliminating the Ashvane Cannoneer as soon as possible. Once the Ashvane Cannoneer is defeated, you can pick up the cannon and shoot back at the ship to cause Captain Lockwood to leap back into the encounter. The next boss is going to be Hadal Darkfathom, and just like Captain Lockwood, this one also saw a few changes from their time in Battle for Azeroth. This boss has only a handful of mechanics, but a lot of these mechanics now have a bit of a much bigger overlap than ever before. Throughout this encounter, the boss will primarily cast two abilities: Break Water, which allows rolling water under random enemies to detonate, doing a ton of frost damage to all targets while creating a pool of ice. So you'll want to stay out of the center of the boss arena where there's a big statue to try to keep the ice out of that safe area. Crashing Tide will be an ability that the tank will want to manage. It'll basically be a wave of water that emanates in a frontal line in front of the boss, dealing frost damage, as well as creating even more brine pools that will deal frost damage over time. Try to aim those away from the pillar or from the center statue of the boss arena as best as humanly possible. When the boss reaches 100 energy, he'll use a Tidal Surge ability, which will create walls of waves that will spawn in cardinal directions of the room. However, using the statue in the middle, you can actually hide behind the statue in order to avoid taking damage from the waves. However, unlike the Battle for Azeroth version where you got a singular wave, now you get two waves that happen twice in a row, and the overlap between Breakwater and Crashing Tide can be a very noticeable and a very uncomfortable part of this encounter, so movement is going to be key, as well as keeping majority of the boss mechanics away from the statue to have a safe spot for you to stand on. Now the final boss is going to be Vic Goth, which you're not necessarily really fighting the big squid boss. Instead, you're fighting the tentacles and using the cannon to attack the boss. You'll want to use 3 different cannons on 3 platforms of that encounter, and once you use 3 cannons, then the boss fight is defeated. In every single one of the platforms, you'll start by attacking the Demolishing Terror, which does a Hull Cracker ability if no tank is around. Otherwise, that tentacle uses a Slam ability, which deals a ton of group-wide damage while also knocking all players back. And you'll want to focus on Demolishing Terror Tentacle before attacking the Grip and Terror Tentacle, although dot classes could probably dot both of them up safely. And you'll want to defeat both of these tentacles in order to get a Culturan Cannoneer to repair the cannon that you can shoot at the boss. Throughout this encounter, the boss is also going to hit the group with Eradication, which will fire a blast of water surrounding a massive area of the boss arena or boss platform. And periodically, the boss is going to cast Putrid Waters at 2 players, which will deal a ton of instant damage and will leave a pretty hefty dot on the target for 30 seconds. This effect needs to be dispelled instantly by the healer, and then the healer will have to manage the other player with a debuff with healing up until they could also be dispelled. Certain classes like Priests as well as Warlocks come with an additional dispel, which may make this encounter a little bit easier to get through. Once the cannon is repaired, one of the players needs to hop in a cannon, shoot at the boss, and to traverse to the next platform. And essentially, you gotta get through all 3 platforms doing exactly the same mechanics up until the boss is defeated, or rather, really just hit by a cannon 3 times in a row. Now the final dungeon is going to be Grim Batol, a Cataclysm dungeon, which has gone through a number of changes to get a prep for the War Within expansion. But right before we get to fight the very first boss of this encounter, Grim Batol still has kept its unique mechanic of this dragon bombardment section, where you have to mount on a drake and you get access to 2 different abilities, and you get to soften up a few enemies along your way towards the first boss. For this part of the instance, you will have 2 abilities. One of them is a big nuke ability, usually marked towards your number 1 ability on the keyboard. That ability you'll want to use on any 5 enemies that are closest stacked together in order to eliminate them more efficiently. The other ability is a smaller fireball ability that you'll want to channel and cast as much as possible all throughout a flight to try to clean up the space as best as you can to make it a little bit easier for you to make your way towards the first boss. The actual first boss itself is going to be General Umbrus, who has a handful of mechanics. The main one is going to be Commanding Roar, which does massive amounts of AoE damage to your party, while also sends out Twilight Drakes to do the Shadowflame Breath Bombardment, marking off 3/4 of the room as under Shadowflame, and only 1/4 of the room will be a safe spot. You want to travel to the safe spot as a group as quickly as possible. Shortly after every single one of these commanding roars, you will have rock spikes appear under players on Mythic difficulty, where you want to place those rock spikes towards the safer parts of the room, and then once the spikes erupt, they'll leave rumbling earth on the ground. So the longer this encounter goes on, the less usable space you'll have while doing this fight. The tank is also going to get hit by a nasty tank buster ability called Skull Splitter, where they'll do a ton of damage back to the tank, while also applying a bleeding effect to them that does stack and lasts for 8 seconds. The next boss is going to be Forge Master Throngus, who actually utilized the entire big circle called Dara area as his entire boss arena, so you can actually do a little bit of cleanup before you engage this boss directly. For Forge Master Thrungus, most of his mechanics are going to be based on the weapons that he forges, and it gets forged in a very specific rotation. Every time Forge Master Thrungus forges a weapon, he'll deal radiating AoE damage, which is going to be something for the healer to manage. The first weapon Thrungus is going to forge is an axe, which will face at a random player, and will use a frontal cleave attack, which will leave lava on the ground. So you want to make sure to stack as a group and bait the axe in a specific direction to limit the amount of flames that he can conjure. The second weapon is going to be a set of swords, where he'll attack at the tank, doing a ton of physical and fire damage. During that time, the sparks from his attacks will send out molten sparks at a player, which will create even more lava pools on the ground. Now his final weapon is going to be a molten mace, which increases his melee damage by 1000% for 10 seconds. During that time, the tank will want to avoid the boss as much as possible, but the mace he makes is always forged a little bit too heavy, so he becomes much slower when traveling with a mace. Though as he's traveling with that mace, all of the fire that's been left on the ground starts to expand and grow, which is why you'll want to utilize as much of the room as possible in order to try to deal with the fire that keeps on growing throughout this encounter. The next boss is going to be Darkflame, the Shadow Burner, which has two phases that are very similar, with the phase 1 being like a introductory version, while the phase 2 being a little bit heavier version with everything kind of turned up to an 11. For the first phase, you'll have abilities such as Invocation of Shadow Flame, where Darkflame will create an area where an invoked Shadow Flame spirit will spawn out of, which will fixate on a player and chase after them. You simply want to eliminate these flame spirits as best as possible, or keep them crowd controlled with things such as freezing traps if you can. Ignore them completely. If a spirit does reach a player, it does group-wide damage, so it's better to eliminate it if you can crowd control it outright. The boss is also going to periodically cast at random players Shadow Flame Bolt, primarily at the tank, and will affect everybody with a Curse of Entropy, which is a curse effect that can be removed by certain class abilities. When the boss technically dies, he actually jumps off the cliff and gets on the back of a dragon, Veliona. With the dragon, he essentially does the same mechanics, but they're empowered a little. Like, for example, whenever he uses his Invocation of Shadow Flame ability, instead of spawning one spirit, he'll spawn two. The Curse of Entropy will happen at the same time as the dragon does a light buffet attack, which will knock players away but also slow them, making it much harder for them to deal with the adds that are crouching upon them. The boss will also use a Devouring Flame frontal ability, which the tank and the group want to avoid as best as humanly possible, though the encounter ends when Veliona reaches 50% remaining health. And the final boss of Grim Batol is going to be Eridax, the Duke of Below. Well, this fight is actually a little bit more familiar to the original encounter back from Cataclysm, but with a lot more tentacles. For this encounter, the boss is going to target the tank with a tank buster called Crush, doing a ton of physical as well as shadow damage and knocking the tank back. The knockback is going to be extra important because you don't want to be knocked into a tendril. From time to time, the boss is going to unleash a Void Surge ability, which does a little bit of group-wide damage, but also after Void Surge, it spawns void tendrils throughout the room. If a player gets next to a void tendril or touches one, it grasps the player, stunning them for a few seconds while dealing constant shadow damage to them for 4 seconds. So you want to avoid getting grasped by tendril as best as possible, and it's much better to avoid him than anything. Shortly after pulling the boss is going to use an ability of Shadow Gale, which will slowly begin to gather shadows from around the area, leaving you with only a small spot that is safe. Players want to get around the spot as quickly as possible while avoiding all of the tentacles, and that shadow safe spot can actually be towards the back of the room, front of the room, left or right, or really anywhere in the room, so you want to be very careful of the encroaching shadows and in which way they are going. As soon as players meet up in that safe spot, the boss will then immediately start using Abyssal Corruption, targeting players with a void energy that will be circled around them, dealing damage to all players around them within 6 yards. So you want to separate far enough so you're not overlapping these circles, and every player that is hit by Abyssal Corruption may want to use a defensive if needed by the healer, because it's a lot of outgoing damage to those players specifically. Shortly after that, the boss is going to use a Void Infusion, where they'll infuse Alexstrasza's eggs with void energy, creating Twilight hatchlings, which will slowly crawl towards the boss to assist him in combat. You'll want to be very careful in killing those Twilight hatchlings, as every time one of them dies, it actually causes all players in a group to take 5% increased shadow damage for 15 seconds, and this effect stacks. It is better to actually delay killing all of these hatchlings after the boss uses the ability of Void Surge AoE in order to take as little damage as possible, unless your group has a ton of AoE damage, because you either need to eliminate those hatchlings immediately or delay eliminating them and killing them until the boss does their AoE abilities. Right now in the beta, it's a bit of a tight squeeze when you actually want to eliminate all of those hatchlings. If you do them quickly enough, you can avoid dealing a lot of AoE rate by damage. Otherwise, you should definitely delay it to make sure that you don't end up outright dying during that specific encounter. And with that, that's a very long video, and if you're for some reason watching this to the very end, I do want to thank you. You guys are awesome. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy it or found it informative. Be sure to join our Discord community if you haven't yet already, especially with the new expansion coming out so soon. If you have any questions about anything when it comes to War Within, there's a good chance somebody in the community or I will be able to answer all of your questions directly. But with that, all I have to say is thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you, and I'll see all of you guys in the next guide.